Welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. The Donald Trump administration has informed Romania and other NATO members of its decision to reduce the number of U.S. troops stationed in Eastern Europe, shrinking the contingent in Romania to around 1,000 soldiers. At the same time, Vladimir Putin has formally terminated the U.S.-Russia agreement on plutonium disposal, removing one more pillar of post-Cold War nuclear cooperation. To help us understand the strategic implications of both shifts on the eastern flank, NATO burden sharing, and nuclear arms control, we're joined by Dr. Eoin Micheál McNamara, researcher at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Great to be on once again.
So can you help us understand what does the U.S. decision to reduce the level of, in Romania, say about its priorities in Europe as well as on the global scale?
Well, it's not militarily too significant, as you say. About 1,000 troops, U.S. troops, will remain in Romania for now. And of course, we must remember that NATO's deterrence posture is multinational, US-led, but multinational. Most NATO allies are involved. And of course, it is based on mobilization from west to east if security deteriorates. Some debate whether these forward deployed battle groups are a deterrence force or a tripwire force. That will remain the case. However, politically, it is signaling, or it might be the first signal in US rebalancing, in burden sharing in the transatlantic partnership, and Europe needs to step up to the plate and rethink deterrence for its own continent.
Right. So from what I'm getting, that on the practical level, it's not as impactful as it a lot of people are assuming. However, of course, a lot of times perception is reality, and that kind of signal is also going to have an influence going forward. By pursuing these type of policy, what do you think that the U.S. signal is? And of course, I'm also curious how that might impact Russia's strategic calculus.
Well, we'll have to see what the next steps are. I mean, this was signaled earlier this spring, and it will depend whether this is the first step in a wider drawdown. And let's not forget there are U.S. troops as well in Poland, and U.S. troops in the region rotate in and out of the Baltic states on a near constant basis. So we'll have to see also if those countries are affected. Later on. But this is a signal that the U.S. is rebalancing its force posture to focus more on Asia and focus more on securing its own borders. And as I mentioned before, more is likely left to European forces to fill these gaps in the deterrence posture. And let's hope, I think it's very, very important for deterrence policy in Europe that this is done in a coordinated way, that the carpet isn't pulled out suddenly from underneath the European allies in terms of capabilities that are critical for deterrence in Europe, that there is discussion with the Europeans on which capabilities they can deploy to replace what the Americans take with them. So this needs to be done in a coordinated way to minimize any harm that could potentially be done to deterrence in Europe.
Right now, some people are pointing towards Russia's recent termination of some bilateral cooperation with the United States, especially the plutonium dumping. And at the time, Russia did condition the renewal of these agreements on scaling back NATO in several countries, which coincide with the countries that we are looking at right now. Do you think that these two have any connection, or are we just trying to draw lines between two dots that are not really connected?
No, I don't think these are connected. This has been signaled for a very long time. I mean, straight from the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, almost in the early weeks of him taking office, he signaled this to NATO members at what was a very controversial NATO meeting early last spring. And it was also followed up by the US permanent representative to NATO at at a conference in Tallinn. I think it was in April time. So U.S. priorities are shifting, and I mean, even before the Trump administration, these priorities are shifting. I mean, Barack Obama's administration was controversial. He had previously the pivot to Asia, away from the Middle East and Europe to an extent, and towards Asia. They also call that policy rebalancing. So this rebalancing has been going on for a decade. I suppose Russia's aggression in Ukraine since 2014, escalating in 2022, caused the United States to revert somewhat on that and strengthen its deterrence in Europe. But the broader trend is there. And I think the number one answer to this problem from a European perspective is for Europe to rethink what it needs for its deterrence, and essentially to fill these gaps with its own culture, its own style of deterrence, its own strategic culture.
All right. We're also curious about the overnight announcement on Thursday, where Donald Trump mentioned resumption of nuclear weapon testing, and in his words, quote, on an equal footing with other countries. Can you tell us what signal is he trying to send by the resumption of these nuclear weapon testing? Is it more geared towards Russia, or are they looking at China?
I think, we are entering definitely with statements like this, we are definitely entering a more turbulent time in international affairs, where we're seeing, great power posturing. I mean, there has been, discussions. The Russians have been threatening the last few years whether they will do a nuclear test. We've seen kind of some nuclear saber rattling between India and Pakistan with different conventional conflicts there in recent years. We've seen China enlarge its nuclear arsenal. So I think the United States under Donald Trump wants to be seen as a very strong leader, that essentially he wants to get in on the act now and demonstrate who's number one among the superpowers, who's the strongest among the superpowers. This mooting of a potential nuclear test is perhaps another road on that journey.
And speaking of having a strong presence, going back to the topic about pulling back the NATO troop, it doesn't seem like it has reached a consensus within Washington itself. There are some senators that are very vocal about scaling it back and calling it a bad decision. How is that being perceived inside the United States?
Yeah, I think what we see in the United States is generational change. And I mean, this has been on the cards for more than a decade, 15 years. I remember a famous speech given by the then Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, who served under George W. Bush and Barack Obama, saying that, warning the Europeans, saying that he was one of the last old guys, if you will, that remember that very close transatlantic bond from the Cold War days, and that later generations of U.S. policymakers and U.S. politicians will not have the same sense of bond with Europe, and will look elsewhere in the world as the United States rebalances its priorities as the world shifts. And essentially, as the point I keep coming back to, the Europeans have to do more to maintain that relationship in a rebalanced burden-sharing arrangement between Washington and European capitals. That's, I think, how we keep the United States in Europe, albeit in a more skeletal form.
All right, thank you so much for that. Also curious, we do have a little bit of time. I'm going to pick your brains on this, because we saw recently Trump met Xi Jinping, and I'm curious about the Ukrainian aspect and whether or not this has changed any strategic calculus as the outcome of that meeting.
Well, we'll have to see about that. I mean, the results or the outcomes of this meeting are still really fresh and are still being digested by diplomats in Washington and Beijing and world capitals globally. I would be very, very surprised, though, if Trump did not pressure Xi to put pressure on Vladimir Putin to end his war in Ukraine. I mean, Trump, in my opinion, wants the glory, wants to go down in history as a great peacemaker. And it has been well signaled to him, I mean, by European leaders in particular, that Beijing might hold the key to that pressure on Putin. Trump knows this. And I would be very, very surprised if he didn't, if Trump and his diplomats didn't put strong pressure on Xi, to put diplomatic pressure on Vladimir Putin, and of course end Beijing's clandestine support for Russia's war machine in Ukraine. These moves can go a long, long way towards a situation that can lead to a fair and just peace for Ukraine. China's an important vector in all this. So I'm sure from a Ukrainian perspective, that was an important angle on the talks we saw this week.
All right, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.